All right, we are recording. AP Civics students, welcome to Civics in Action with Mr. McGravy. Today is Wednesday, April 29th, 2020, and I am thrilled to welcome back Senate Minority Leader Bruce Tarr to the AP virtual classroom today. Senator Tarr, how are you?
Well, I'm delighted to be with you on the virtual classroom, Mr. McGravy. I know how innovative you are as a teacher, and I've always admired that. And so this is no exception. And I'm doing well. These are challenging times, but actually doing really well. The only thing that right now is noticeable is that it's a little bit more tiring at the end of the day because of all the things that we're doing during the day. But I might ask also, how are you doing?
I'm doing very, very well. My wife and I are both working from home. I have my fifth grader and my third grader, so they're doing virtual school. I'm doing school with all these wonderful AP NAMS kids. So everyone's healthy, everyone's doing great. So can count our blessings there.
Great. Well, you could probably tell from the background that I'm actually at the State House, and we have generally, depending on the day, either 2 or 3 staff people here with me at the State House, and all of the rest of our staff are working from home, but everyone's doing well, so we're happy about that.
That's great. Now, Senator Tarr, I was kind of joking with one of your assistants when he came on that everybody on Zoom and on Google Meets are doing these fake backdrops, and that is not fake. That is legit. You are at the State House. You have it's a really cool backdrop. It makes for a really everyone else has been in their living rooms, so this has been fantastic. Well, I wanted to ask you, obviously, just refresh us again where you live. Who's at home with you right now, and tell me about work. Tell me about work, home, Beacon Hill. Could you break down a schedule for me, if you don't mind, since, you know, probably around March 13th when all of this kind of went down, at least for my students.
Well, you know, happy to do it. And just to remind folks, I live in Gloucester, and I live on the family farm that my grandparents established when they migrated here from Greece, when they emigrated from Greece. And I'm there by myself with one cat right now. But my brother, who lives up the street, comes to visit every day because there are animals that need to be tended, and he takes care of that. So I get to see him. And then my 94-year-old aunt also lives on the farm compound. She lives in her own home next door. So I get to see her periodically as well. And it's an interesting time because our whole world has changed, just like everyone else's has changed. And I would tell you, when we talk about the time at the outset of the pandemic, when I really noticed that was in a meeting, and I haven't really talked to anybody about this, but we had a meeting in the Senate President's office when we first realized we were going to have to deal with things in a different way. And I'll never forget this, that the Senate President said as we gathered in her office, this is probably the last time we will see each other in person for quite a long time. And that absolutely shocked me to think about that, because we're used to being very busy on Beacon Hill and seeing each other at least every week, if not every single day. And I still carry that memory with me about the thought that I would not see my colleagues in person for a period of time that was then undefined and continues on today. Now, that isn't to say that we don't see each other in some ways, because as you know, and as we've talked about, the legislature is required to meet by the Constitution every 72 hours. Wow. And so we still conduct informal sessions to comply with that constitutional requirement. And normally those sessions are reserved for non-controversial things that no one would object to and really no one wants to debate, and we just move them through. These days, informal sessions have been the only form of session that we could conduct because we need to observe social distancing, and we didn't want to have everybody in the chamber. Right. And so we've been doing things by consensus, which I think is a really important thing. And it's something that I was very eager to talk to you and your students about, is that right now, unlike what you might see anywhere else, in the Massachusetts legislature, every bill that passes is passed without objection by anyone. So we have to work really hard to have consensus. And that doesn't mean we aren't doing bills. We actually are. And we've passed a lot of important bills, and I can talk about those in a few minutes, but it's a very unusual time. And so my days are usually split between being at home for part of the day and being at the State House for part of the day. And usually I don't leave the State House these days until 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night. But part of the reason I can do that is because there are no functions or events or meetings to go to back in our district, in our cities and towns, because they've all been canceled.
Right.
So I can stay at the State House and do the things I need to do here and not have to worry quite so much about getting back home or coming, for instance, to North Andover for a meeting, because there aren't any.
Right.
And so the only thing that, the only reason now I need to worry about getting home is to get home before a restaurant closes.
Yeah, right. Right.
Right.
So Senator Tarr, you're going to work and you're working from home. One of your colleagues at the local level, North Andover Town Manager Melissa Murphy Rodriguez, she's been splitting. She actually recorded from her office as well. So I'm just going to ask you a quick question, and then the next question is actually going to probably weave into what you were just talking about with bills, which
sure.
Very, very excited to hear about.
And by the way, let me just say, I'm glad you had Melissa on. We're very lucky to have her. And of course, she hasn't been on board that long. And, she comes to work as town manager of North Andover and gets thrust into this situation. And we're just so lucky that she's able to deal with it as well as she is.
And she's got her 2 girls, and she's got her husband who works in Medford in government as well.
Yeah.
It's crazy. And in fact, she presented at one of the first Civics in Action talks, and she had been on the job for 1 week, and she came into the class. So it's been great. Okay, so my next question for you, Senator Tarr, is, and again, it can be very, very wide on this because I know you cover a number of communities, but in your opinion, because you've been out there, what has been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Massachusetts, local communities like Andover, Gloucester, North Andover? Could you just touch upon that if you don't mind, since you've been out and about?
Sure. Well, I would say this. As a general proposition, this pandemic has disrupted every facet of our lives. And one of the things that I see every day, whether I'm in the community or I'm here at the State House, is the magnitude and the scope of all of the different things that it has affected. It has affected our ability to, for instance, get food and get groceries. It's impacted our ability to travel because we should be limited in where we're traveling to. It's had an effect on our ability to recreate because many of our recreational facilities are not available to us. It has had a tremendous impact on the way that we communicate. And so now we've become a culture that is far more utilizing of things like Zoom and conference calls and the many other ways that we communicate electronically. Those things were around before, but now they are embedded in our lives, and it's become part of our culture, our daily culture. And so as a general proposition, as I mentioned, I would say that the most noticeable thing is every part of our lives has been affected. And the other thing, though, I think that's important to think about is how we've been able to rediscover the strength of the people that live in our communities and that live in our state, their resilience, their ability to focus on getting things done, and their ability to support each other. And so I'll give you an example. This morning, I was reading one of our local newspapers, and I was reading how a member of the school committee in one of our communities, one of our school districts, decided to build a pop-up pantry. And in that pantry are things that people might need. And so she called on one of the local selectmen who happened to be skilled as a carpenter to build it. And then there was a newspaper photo today of people putting items in it. And it is one of those things where it's rotational. It's intended so people can put things in it and take things out. And there are just so many examples of those things. I cited one, but they're everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's really heartening to see that element of our humanity, that because we tend to become very cynical and we tend to think about negativity and we tend to think about conflict, but so many positive things are happening with regard to how we can stand up and support each other. People making masks at home, people providing meals for our frontline healthcare providers, people just doing so many different things. I don't think I've ever seen as many parades, Mr. McGravy, as I'm seeing right now for birthdays,
workers, everything.
everybody. And what a great thing. And this is a terrible, terrible tragedy that we're living through with the loss of life and so many people being sick. But on the flip side, what a wonderful thing to see the inherent good nature in everybody around us.
And if I can make a comparison, you know, and I'm sure you've heard about this, but this remote learning, you know, the New York Times and the Washington Post have done a number of articles. And right now, I think the national rate of participation of kids remotely is about 50%. And based on my grading last week, I'm at about 88, 90%. So my students are doing tremendous amount of work throughout all of this. And everyone's saying, do you miss your students? Of course I miss my students. I miss the live experience, but I've connected with so many of them one-on-one. I mean, I'm emailing them. We're having, you know, conferences with one another. I feel like I know them almost more than I did before because, you know, during the school day, you've been to NAMS. It's busy. It's crazy. There's lots of people. So I think you choosing to find some positive is a healthy attitude. That's what I've been trying to do with a lot of these things, with these shows and these things that I'm doing. I'm just trying to kind of reinvent myself a little bit and hopefully making it engaging for the kids. And it's been working pretty well. So you mentioned bills and filing of bills, and this is right up the alley of this question. So I'm going to ask you, you've met my students, you've come in, which was great. They clearly are very civically engaged. They know their civics well. And so how a bill becomes a law is something more than just something on a piece of paper for them. So this relates to how are the governor, who we all know the executive branch, and the Massachusetts Senate and the House of Representatives, the legislative branch, how are you working together? We're seeing it at the federal level with the stimulus bill, but maybe kids aren't knowing about the state level because that might not be on the national news. So could you just talk a little bit about the branches working together with some of the bills that you just maybe wanted to hint at a few moments ago?
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. And by the way, let me just say parenthetically, it's no surprise to see the level of engagement that you and your students have. And it's really laudable to see how you're using technology to overcome the challenges about distancing that we have to live through. So I couldn't get away without saying that. So I want to add that.
And I would tell people that I've probably learned more on my own in technology in a month than I have in at least 10 years. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable how much you learn when you're forced into it. So please, right back to the point. Thank you, Ken.
So we've talked about in your classes before, about one of the unique things in Massachusetts is that everybody once a week sits at the table, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the two minority leaders, the governor, the lieutenant governor, the Secretary of Administration and Finance. All of the stakeholders generally meet once a week, and it generally happens on Monday. Now that's happening at least twice a week, and sometimes even more frequently than that. And basically what happens is we identify a problem, and I'll give you an example of one of those problems. Documents need to be notarized. We know about that when we do a will or a trust or we sell a home, those things need to have notarization, which means that a notary public witnesses the people signing the documents and verifies who those people are so that the documents have integrity. Well, with social distancing, that's generally not possible right now, which means that a lot of people, particularly now who are thinking about needing a will or a trust, it's a sad fact of our times, had those tools beyond their reach. And so we identified the problem, and what other states had done was use video conferencing, just like what you and I are doing right now, to allow the notary to witness that signing through a video conference.
Wow.
And then to have the documents mailed to them and verify everything that's happening. And we put together a bill. I actually filed the bill with a number of my colleagues. And like most bills, it had to work its way through the evolutionary process because it wasn't perfect at the start. And we worked on a version of it. The House worked on a version of it. And to make a very long story short, that bill got signed into law by the governor a couple of days ago. And that's a pretty significant piece of legislation that was done for one reason and one reason only, and that's collaboration. Mm-hmm. We all work together. We all worked out our differences, which were mainly technical because we wanted to get it right, and we got a bill to the governor's desk. And Mr. McGravy, the thing that I would emphasize is that has happened many times during the pandemic. We've worked on a bill, for instance, 2 bills now, relative to unemployment insurance, which is so important to people in the economic climate that we live today. We've dealt with public health bills. We have dealt with bills that would prevent people from being evicted from their homes during this time of pandemic. So we are working together. And as I mentioned, we've been working by consensus because in any informal session, in either the House or the Senate, any member can object and stop the proceedings. And we haven't had that happen except for once, and it only held up the proceedings for 1 day until those differences got worked out. But here's the challenge. There are times, particularly pursuant to our Constitution, that we need to have a roll call vote, a recorded vote. And to have a roll call vote, we need to have a formal session. And one of those times is upon us. It's coming very quickly. And it's coming because we moved the date that income taxes were going to be payable in Massachusetts. And that creates a huge revenue gap for us because we won't have the revenue from people paying their taxes now for a while, but we need to keep state government running.
Yes.
We also think we're going to get a significant amount of money from the federal government. And we've all witnessed the stimulus bills that have been passed, but we don't have all of that yet either. And so we actually have to borrow some money in a short-term way to continue to have the cash flow of state government that we need to pay for everything that we have to fund. Now, under the Constitution, that requires a recorded roll call vote. All borrowing does. So right now, the Senate and the House are trying to figure out how we can conduct a formal session that will comport with the requirements of the Constitution so that we can borrow the money literally to keep state government moving.
Senator Tarr, another bill that maybe you could talk a little bit about is the one having to do with MCAS and the Commissioner of DESE. I think my students appreciate that. And do you want to talk a little bit and give us a little insider about the MCAS, not having MCAS this year and the process and the deliberations? And I think my students would find that very interesting.
I'd be happy to talk about that. It's a subject that got a lot of attention, and it should have gotten a lot of attention because obviously we don't want to abandon having accountability. We want to make sure that our kids are being taught and that we know they're being taught specific subjects and specific amounts of information. We don't want to cast that aside. But at the same time, it was clear to a lot of us, if not all of us, that MCAS was just not consistent with the environment that we're in right now. So Commissioner Riley made it clear to the legislature that he could not eliminate MCAS, suspend it for this year without a legislative act, because it was a statutory requirement to begin with.
And law, right?
If it was a regulation, then he could have taken action unilaterally, but it's not. And so it came up before us, and it was actually a pretty straightforward proposition. We all agreed that, again, MCAS just wasn't compatible with the current environment. And so it was a fairly easy decision to discontinue it for this year. Now, one of the interesting things about that, though, is that Commissioner Riley and Secretary of Education Jim Pizer wanted to make sure that while we were getting rid of MCAS for now, that we still would have the ability to do some testing as might be necessary either now or as we approach fall, just to figure out where students are. So we gave latitude to have some diagnostic type testing, but what we did do, as you've already referenced, was eliminate for this year the sort of high stakes standardized test in the form of the MCAS. So perfect example. We identified a problem. The commissioner said, I'd like to do this, but I can't. Legislature, I need permission. And we responded with a resounding yes, you have that permission, and Governor Baker signed the bill into law.
I want to definitely be respectful of your time. We're doing really well time-wise. Just 2 more talking points, and I'm going to let you go on with your day. I'm sure you have a lot to do with meetings. I'm sure you remember when we came in, probably at the tail end of the conversation that you had with my students, we were talking about the lowering the voting age bill. You remember that?
Yeah.
And one of the big parts of the Harvard curriculum through the Democratic Knowledge Project that we were doing was an editorial and then a civics action project, which is part of the civics action bill. We're clearly not going to be able to do those, but we are going to soldier on in some fashion. So what my students are is they're going back to the issue of the voting bill, and they're doing some really, really great research. We're teaching them how to research. And obviously, you don't have to spend a lot of time on this, and I know you've been busy with other things, but when we spoke last, you were leaning towards against the bill, and you provided some rationale why. Can you give my students an update? Because actually State Representative Vargas is going to do one of these with me tomorrow as well. So that would be great if you could just give us a little update on that, or if you
Sure.
had to think about it, Senator Tarr.
No, sure. So first of all, I'm glad Andy will be joining you. He'll be a great guest, I know, for your discussion, number one. Number two, I'm really happy to hear that all that research is being done, because having folks that are informed in the process is really important, so they can share their perspectives with us as well. As I mentioned when we last talked about this, I do have concerns, and my concerns actually center around some of the research that I've seen and some of the research that I've done relative to brain formation and ability to make decisions. And so in the legislature recently, we've had a lot of examples of people with scientific backgrounds and research backgrounds explaining to us why we should raise the age of things. So,
Right.
for instance, we've had a compelling case made, and I support this idea, of raising the age for tobacco consumption. And that's based on the fact that we need more full brain development and more maturity to be able to make decisions about things like tobacco usage. I agree with that. I also was part of the criminal justice reform bill, where we were presented with a lot of information, both as members of the legislature and members of the conference committee, that tended to suggest that for issues of criminal culpability, for being responsible for our own acts, that we don't have full brain development into our 20s. And so when I look at those things, I hunger for information that would suggest to me why the brain might not be developed fully enough to be responsible for our own actions in a criminal context, or responsible enough to make good decisions about substance use in the tobacco context, why that would be different for voting, which again involves critically important decisions. So that's where I'm at, and really try to look at these things in terms of a research basis and a factual basis. And I'm really glad to hear that from what you were explaining, your students are doing the very same thing.
And Senator Tarr, a cool plug for my students, they are going to be doing research this week, and next week they'll be writing a mini editorial / testimony statement. And I'm going to be putting a document together for Representative Vargas, and I will send your staff a copy of that as well, so you can check out all the great research that the AP NAM students have been doing. Does that sound like a plan?
That would be fantastic. I'd really appreciate being able to receive that.
Excellent. Okay, last thing, final words, wrap up. As we were talking with the town manager, a lot of the kids gave me feedback that hearing her, and I think they're going to feel the same way hearing you, they felt very reassured. So if you could end with some reassuring words to my students who may be experiencing stress or some anxiety right now, it'd be a great opportunity for you to kind of reassure them and let them know what's going on. I think that we would all appreciate that in these times.
I'm really happy to do that. And I want to start first with an acknowledgement that we're all human beings. And we see people around us that are becoming victims of the pandemic. We're losing loved ones. We see a lot of concerning things every day. We have relatives who are ill and can't leave their home. It's natural for us to feel those kinds of anxieties and even depression, because we're human. But it's also important to realize some context, And the context is that we in Massachusetts in particular live in a state with some of the best healthcare in the world, with some of the best medical research in the world. And so what we're seeing every day are things like increasing the amount of testing that's happening, which is a critical tool in combating the spread of the pandemic. We're seeing a lot of research being done right here in Massachusetts about vaccines that can help inoculate us against getting the virus ourselves. We're seeing a lot of research about therapeutic drugs. And we're seeing that we do have some control over the situation. And by that, I mean this. One of the things I know about human nature, and I've talked with you in the class before, is when we feel like things are out of control, that's when we start to get really filled with anxiety. But here's a situation where we do have an element of control, that if we wash our hands, if we cover our cough, if we stay in our homes unless we need to be out and about, those may seem like really simple things, but that gives us the control to control the spread and limit the curve here on the spread of the virus. And it's working. So one of the things that we heard earlier this week, and I shared a public service announcement on my social media from some of the doctors in the Boston medical community, is that we've done so well at bending that curve, at flattening that curve, that hospitals have plenty of capacity, not only to treat people with COVID-19, but to treat people with other kinds of afflictions like heart disease or diabetes or other kinds of things that require hospitalization. So my point to all of our students would be, sure, we are facing a tough time together, and we're going to continue to face that. But there are things that every one of us can do to make a positive difference, whether it be doing the things that I described, or whether it be helping someone with a task that needs to be done, or doing research that can help us be more enlightened about the situation, or just reminding people that we care about that we're there to support them. All of those things.
Great. That's great.
And within our reach.
That's fantastic. Well, I know you have other meetings to get to, and I just want to say that the 8B students and I, all 120 plus of them and me, really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. This is very engaging for my students. We're trying to do engaging things for them at home, and for them to watch this video and then reflect on it is very engaging, and I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your good work. As I said, it's no surprise to me that you're continuing to innovate. And I would say this, we may run out of time this school year, but I look forward to the day when Representative Vargas and I and others can give you a personal tour of the State House, and we can be back together again in the same place.
That sounds like a great reunion for my students and I. And Senator Tarr, I also want to say, please, if you want to tell any of your friends about, Mr. McGravy's Civics in Action, we can always use new guests. So
okay.
Please spread the good word and speak to your colleagues, both Democrat and Republican, because the more my students see you all, the more civics comes alive for them. And this has just been great.
Well, it's been great for me too, and I really apologize about the limited time, but I appreciate the opportunity. And to be honest, it's a great break in between conference calls. So it's been fantastic.
Great.
I wish everyone the best, and please don't hesitate to call on us in the future. And I hope everyone stays safe, and we'll see you again soon.
Great. So to my students, I'm going to say this will be up and running pretty soon. Senator Tarr, I'm going to hit stop record, and just so I can say goodbye to you. So 8B students, thank you very much.